Hello and welcome to Moonlit History, in the heart of ancient Alexandria, where the Mediterranean Sea kissed the Egyptian shore. There stood a building that contained more knowledge than any structure before or since. Imagine walking through its endless corridors, past hundreds of thousands of scrolls, each one a repository of human thought, scientific discovery, poetry, philosophy, and secrets that we will never recover. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a library, it was the memory of civilization itself, and its destruction remains one of history's most haunting losses. But here's what most people get wrong. The library didn't burn down in one dramatic fire. The truth is far stranger, more complex, and in many ways more tragic than the legend suggests. Let's go back to the beginning to understand what was really lost and why it still matters today. It's around 330 BCE, and Alexander the Great has just died in Babylon at the impossibly young age of 32. His empire, stretching from Greece to India, immediately fragments as his generals tear it apart like wolves, fighting over a carcass. One of these generals, Ptolemy, seizes Egypt and establishes himself as pharaoh, founding a dynasty that would last 3 centuries and end with Cleopatra. But Ptolemy wanted more than just political power. He wanted to create something that would outlast any military conquest. A centre of learning that would attract the greatest minds in the world. Alexandria was the perfect location. Founded by Alexander himself just a few years earlier, it sat at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Its harbours welcome ships from every corner of the known world, bringing not just trade goods, but ideas, stories, and knowledge. Ptolemy and his son, Ptolemy II, envisioned a massive complex that would include not just a library, but a museum, though not the kind we think of today. The Mouseion, as it was called, was literally a temple to the Muses, the Greek goddesses of arts and sciences. It was more like a modern university, with lecture halls, gardens, a zoo, laboratories, and living quarters for scholars who were paid by the state to do nothing but think, debate, and write. The library itself was obsessive in its collection strategy. Ships arriving at Alexandria's harbour were searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated. These would be copied by expert scribes, and if the ship's captain was lucky, he'd get the copy back, while Alexandria kept the original. Sometimes they kept both. The library sent agents across the known world to purchase or copy texts. They paid enormous sums for the official state copies of the great Greek tragedies from Athens, promising to return them after copying. They kept the originals and sent back the copies, forfeiting their massive deposit without a second thought. This wasn't simple book collecting. This was a systematic attempt to gather all human knowledge in one place. At its height, estimates suggest the library held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To understand what this means, remember that each scroll contained far less text than a modern book. Many scrolls held just a single play, poem, or philosophical treatise. Even so, this represented virtually everything written in the ancient world that the library's agents could acquire. Works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, geography, history, literature, and philosophy from Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Indian, and Jewish scholars lined the shelves. Euclid developed his geometry here. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference here with stunning accuracy, getting within 50 miles of the actual figure using nothing but shadows and geometry. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun 1700 years before Copernicus. Herophilos dissected human bodies and discovered that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence. The head librarian was always one of the most respected scholars of the age. These weren't just custodians, but intellectual leaders. The poet Callimachus created the first library catalogue, the Pinakes, a 120-volume bibliographic survey of Greek literature. This catalogue was itself a monumental work of scholarship, organizing human knowledge into categories that influenced how we classify information to this day. Scholars came from across the Mediterranean to study here, supported by royal patronage, with free meals and no teaching duties. It was perhaps the closest thing the ancient world ever created to an ideal republic of letters. But nothing gold can stay, and the library's fortunes were always tied to the stability of the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egypt itself. As Rome grew more powerful and Egypt's independence weakened, the great institution began its long, slow decline. This is where the popular story gets it wrong. There was no single fire, no one barbarian horde that destroyed the library in an act of anti-intellectual vandalism. Instead, the library died slowly, through a combination of accidents, neglect, religious conflict, and changing priorities that spanned centuries. The first major blow may have come from Julius Caesar himself, though even this is debated by historians. In 48 BCE, Caesar found himself trapped in Alexandria during the civil war with Pompey. He'd sided with Cleopatra in her power struggle with her brother Ptolemy XIII. When Egyptian forces loyal to Ptolemy surrounded Caesar's position near the harbour, he ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet to prevent it from being used against him. The fire spread beyond the ships. Ancient sources tell us that it reached the docks and destroyed some buildings near the harbour, and that scrolls were damaged or destroyed in this fire. But how many? And were these scrolls from the main library or from a warehouse near the docks where scrolls were stored for export? The ancient writers give us contradictory accounts. Some later sources claim that 40,000 scrolls burned, or even the entire library. But contemporary accounts, including Caesar's own writings, don't mention the library at all. The main library building was located in the royal quarter, a good distance from the harbour where the fire occurred. Most scholars today believe that what burned was either a warehouse containing duplicate scrolls intended for export, or possibly a smaller branch library. The Great Library itself likely survived, though perhaps with some losses. But if Caesar's fire didn't destroy the library, what did? To understand this, we need to understand that there wasn't just one library, but at least two major collections in Alexandria. The original library was in the Bruttian district, part of the royal palace complex. Later, probably under Ptolemy III, a second library was established in the Temple of Serapis, called the Serapeum. This temple library became increasingly important as Alexandria's demographics and power structures shifted. As the centuries passed and Egypt became increasingly integrated into the Roman Empire, the exact status of these institutions becomes murky in our sources. By the time Rome fully absorbed Egypt after the Battle of Actium in 30 BCE, when Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, the library was already past its prime. The Ptolemies had been its primary patrons, and Roman emperors had different priorities. There's a suggestive silence in our sources. Writers in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE mention the library in the past tense, or don't mention it at all. The great scholars are no longer flocking to Alexandria as they once did. When the Emperor Claudius wanted to build a new wing onto the library in the 1st century CE, it's unclear if he was expanding a thriving institution or trying to revive one that had already declined significantly. One theory suggests that the main library in the Bruttian, the original library founded by the Ptolemies, was actually destroyed in 273 CE during the Roman Emperor Aurelian's siege of Alexandria. Aurelian was putting down a revolt by Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who had temporarily seized Egypt. During the fighting, the Bruttian district, where the palace and the old library were located, was severely damaged or destroyed. There's no specific mention of the library in accounts of this destruction. But then again, by this point, it may not have been significant enough to mention specifically. If the library still existed here in any meaningful form, this would likely have been its end. But what about the Serapeum, the temple library? This continued to function for another century and became the focal point of one of history's most significant religious confrontations. By the late 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The old pagan temples were under increasing pressure, seen as sites of demonic worship by zealous Christian leaders. The Serapeum was one of the largest and most magnificent temples in the ancient world, and it still housed a significant collection of scrolls, though probably nothing like the original library's holdings. In 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued a decree calling for the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. In Alexandria, this sparked violence between Christians and pagans. The Christian Patriarch of Alexandria, Theophilus, led a crowd that destroyed the Serapeum. Contemporary accounts focus on the destruction of the pagan idols, particularly the statue of Serapis itself. They describe how pagans had barricaded themselves in the temple, how they eventually surrendered after the emperor promised them amnesty, and how the temple was then demolished and a Christian church built on its ruins. But what about the scrolls? Curiously, the most detailed contemporary Christian accounts of the Serapeum's destruction don't mention a library or scrolls at all. The pagan writer Eunapius mentions the destruction, but doesn't specifically reference scrolls being burned. It's only much later, in the 6th century, that sources begin claiming that a great library was destroyed when the Serapeum fell. By this time, 200 years had passed, and the legend of the library had grown in the retelling. Did the Serapeum still house a significant library in 391, or had its collection already been dispersed, stolen, or rotted away? The silence of the contemporary sources is conspicuous. You'd think that if a major library had been destroyed, someone would have mentioned it at the time. This brings us to one of the most persistent and controversial legends, that the library was destroyed by Muslim conquerors in the 7th century on the orders of Caliph Umar. The story goes that when the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria in 641 CE, he wrote to the Caliph asking what to do with the books in the library. Umar supposedly replied that if the books contradicted the Quran, they were heretical and should be burned, and if they agreed with the Quran, they were superfluous and should be burned. The books were then used to fuel the fires of the city's bathhouses, and it took 6 months to burn them all. It's a dramatic story, but virtually all serious historians today reject it as a later fabrication. The story doesn't appear in any source until nearly 600 years after the supposed event. It's first told by Bishop Gregory Bar Hebraeus, a Christian writing in the 13th century. No contemporary or near-contemporary Muslim or Christian source mentions anything about Arabs destroying a library in Alexandria. Given that Christian writers of the time had plenty of incentive to record Muslim destruction of Christian or classical sites, this silence is highly significant. Moreover, the library had almost certainly ceased to exist in any meaningful form long before the Arab conquest. The evidence suggests this story was invented much later, possibly during the Crusades, to serve as anti-Muslim propaganda. So if there was no single dramatic destruction, what really happened? The answer is both more mundane and more melancholy. The Library of Alexandria died the way most great institutions die, slowly, from a combination of declining resources, changing priorities, political instability, natural disasters, and simple neglect. Ancient scrolls were fragile. Made from papyrus, a plant-based material, they would deteriorate if not properly maintained. They needed to be copied regularly to preserve their contents. This required money, skilled scribes, and an institution that valued and prioritized this work. As the Roman Empire declined, as resources became scarcer, as intellectual life fragmented and contracted, as religious conflicts intensified, the conditions that had allowed the library to flourish disappeared. Scrolls that weren't copied would rot. Scrolls that weren't read would be forgotten. Buildings that weren't maintained would collapse. Collections that weren't funded would be broken up and sold. A library isn't just a building or a collection of books. It's an active institution that requires constant care, curation, and intellectual engagement. When that stops, the library dies, even if the building still stands and scrolls still sit on shelves. There's a poignant detail that historians note. In the 4th century, Alexandria still had scholars and teachers who might have used a library if one had existed in full form. Yet we have complaints from this period about the difficulty of finding texts, about the scarcity of certain works. The library, if it existed at all, was clearly a shadow of its former self. By the 5th century, the trail goes cold. There are no more references to scholars using the library, no more mentions of its holdings. The institution had simply ceased to function, and apparently so gradually that no one thought it worth recording the final moment. What was lost? This is the question that haunts us. We know of many works only because they're mentioned or quoted in other texts. Entire categories of literature have vanished. Of the roughly 80 plays written by Aeschylus, we have 7. Of Sophocles' 120 plays, 7 survive. Euripides wrote 92 plays, and we have 18. These are the lucky ones, considered the greatest playwrights of Athens. Countless other poets, playwrights, and writers have vanished completely, known to us only by name, if at all. The mathematician Apollonius of Perga wrote 8 books on conic sections. The first 4 survive in Greek, the next 3 only in Arabic translation, and the 8th is lost entirely, known only from references. The astronomer Hipparchus created the first comprehensive star catalogue and made groundbreaking discoveries about the precession of the equinoxes. His original works are lost. We know about them only because Ptolemy, writing 3 centuries later, cited them. The loss extends beyond individual works to entire intellectual traditions. Ancient medicine was far more sophisticated than many people realize, but most medical texts are lost. We have fragments, quotations, and a few complete works, but the actual cutting-edge medical knowledge of Alexandria, where human dissection was practiced and detailed anatomical studies were conducted, is mostly gone. The same applies to engineering, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and countless other fields. Every lost book represents not just words on a page, but accumulated human experience, observation, and reasoning. When we lost the library, we lost shortcuts to knowledge that had to be painfully rediscovered, centuries or millennia later, if at all. Some scholars argue we might still be catching up. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek analog computer used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses, was so technologically sophisticated that nothing comparable existed again until the 14th century. We only know about it because one device happened to survive in a shipwreck. How many other innovations, recorded in scrolls in Alexandria, were lost? What medical treatments did we have to rediscover? What mathematical proofs were worked out by ancient scholars and then forgotten, requiring later mathematicians to start from scratch? There's also a more subtle loss, one that's harder to quantify. The Library of Alexandria represented a particular vision of knowledge, universal, comprehensive, accessible to scholars, regardless of origin, supported as a public good by the state. This vision didn't survive. In the centuries after the library's decline, knowledge became more fragmented, more localized, more often controlled by religious institutions with doctrinal concerns or by private individuals. The idea that a state would invest massive resources simply to collect and preserve all knowledge, to support scholars with no immediate practical agenda, wouldn't fully resurface until the creation of modern research universities and national libraries more than 1,000 years later. Yet the library's legacy persisted in unexpected ways. When Arab scholars began translating Greek texts in the 8th and 9th centuries, They were working from manuscripts that had been copied from texts that had once resided in Alexandria. Many Greek philosophical and scientific works survived only because they were translated into Arabic, then later translated back into Latin when European scholars rediscovered them during the Renaissance. The library's diaspora, the scattering of its texts across the Mediterranean world as scholars fled or collections were broken up, paradoxically helped ensure that some knowledge survived. If everything had remained in one place, it all might have been lost together. Modern archaeology has tried to find physical traces of the library, but Alexandria is a difficult site to excavate. The ancient city lies beneath the modern city, with millions of people living above the ruins. What we can excavate is often underwater, as significant portions of the ancient city, including parts of the royal quarter where the original library likely stood, now lie beneath the Mediterranean due to earthquakes and subsidence. Underwater archaeologists have found spectacular ruins, including parts of Cleopatra's palace, colossal statues and ancient streets, but nothing that can be definitively identified as the Great Library. No inscriptions saying, "This is the library," no distinctive architectural features that match descriptions from ancient texts. The building is as lost as its contents. What we do have are tantalizing descriptions from ancient writers. They tell us the library was vast with multiple halls and corridors. There were rooms for storing scrolls, organized by subject. There were reading rooms where scholars could study. There was a large common area where intellectuals would gather to debate. The Mausion complex included gardens, walkways, and dining facilities. Strabo, the geographer who visited Alexandria around 25 BCE, describes the Mauseon as having a public walk, a covered area with seats, and a large house containing the common dining room for the scholars. But his description is frustratingly vague on the library itself, perhaps because by his time it was already declining or dispersed. One of the most intriguing aspects of the library was how it functioned as an institution. The scholars weren't just passive readers, they were actively editing and standardizing texts. Before Alexandria, ancient texts existed in multiple versions with significant variations. A play by Euripides might exist in several different manuscripts with different lines, different scenes, even different endings. The Alexandrian scholars pioneered the practice of textual criticism, comparing different versions, trying to determine which was most authentic, and creating standardized editions. They invented punctuation and accent marks for Greek. They created commentary texts explaining difficult passages in Homer or other ancient authors. This work was essential because it created authoritative versions that later scribes would copy, ensuring at least some consistency in textual transmission. The competitive atmosphere among scholars was intense. These were the intellectual celebrities of their age, and they weren't always generous to each other. The poet Callimachus and the poet Apollonius of Rhodes, both associated with the library, became bitter rivals. Their feud was partly personal and partly reflected different visions of poetry, with Callimachus favouring short, polished works and Apollonius writing epic poetry in the style of Homer. Such disputes were common. Intellectual life at the library was vibrant, contentious, and sometimes petty, much like academic life today. Scholars competed for royal patronage, disputed each other's theories, and wrote savage critiques of their rivals' work. The library also became a site of remarkable cross-cultural exchange. The Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek here, producing the Septuagint, which became the standard version for Greek-speaking Jews and early Christians. Egyptian priests who could still read hieroglyphics worked alongside Greek scholars. When the historian Manetho wrote his history of Egypt in Greek, drawing on ancient Egyptian king lists, he was participating in this cultural synthesis. Later, Jewish philosophers like Philo of Alexandria would attempt to reconcile Jewish theology with Greek philosophy, producing works that influenced early Christianity. The library was a place where different civilizations' knowledge systems collided, merged, and transformed each other. But this cosmopolitanism also made the library vulnerable. As political winds shifted, as different groups competed for power in Alexandria, the library and its scholars could become targets. Alexandria was notorious for its riots and civil unrest. The city had distinct ethnic quarters for Greeks, Jews, and Egyptians, and tensions between these communities sometimes exploded into violence. The large Jewish community was particularly vulnerable. In 38 CE, there was a massive pogrom against Alexandrian Jews. In 115 CE, during the Kitos War, the conflict between Jews and Greeks in the city was so severe that much of Alexandria was destroyed. Did the library survive these upheavals? Our sources don't tell us, but it's hard to imagine that an institution dependent on stability and state support could thrive in such conditions. Religious conflicts intensified as Christianity grew more powerful. The murder of Hypatia in 415 CE symbolizes the end of an era. Hypatia was a philosopher and mathematician, the daughter of Theon, one of the last scholars associated with the Mausion. She taught Neoplatonic philosophy and mathematics, and she was renowned throughout the Mediterranean for her learning. She was also a pagan in an increasingly Christian city. When she became entangled in a political dispute between the Christian patriarch Cyril and the Roman prefect Orestes, a Christian mob dragged her from her chariot, stripped her, and murdered her with broken pottery shards. Her body was torn apart and burned. The ancient sources disagree about the exact circumstances. Some blame Cyril directly for inciting the murder. Others suggested it was the work of overzealous monks acting without his orders. But regardless of who exactly was responsible, Hypatia's death marked a turning point. She was the last known member of the Mausion, the last representative of Alexandria's ancient tradition of pagan scholarship. After her death, the few remaining pagan intellectuals in Alexandria either converted, fled, or kept their heads down. The dream of the library, of a universal collection of knowledge transcending religious and cultural boundaries, was incompatible with an age of religious certainty and doctrinal enforcement. Yet Christianity also became a preserver of classical learning, even as it transformed that learning to suit its purposes. Christian monasteries would become the libraries of the medieval world. Monks would copy and preserve many ancient texts, though with obvious selectivity. Works compatible with Christian theology or useful for Christian education were more likely to be copied. Works about pagan religious practices or philosophical works that contradicted Christian doctrine too directly were less likely to survive. Still, without these Christian scribes, we would know even less about the ancient world. The Great Library of Constantinople, established by Constantine as the new Rome in the East, inherited some of Alexandria's role, though it too would eventually be lost, its contents destroyed when the city fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204 and again when it fell to the Ottomans in 1453. In the Islamic world, a similar pattern emerged. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 8th century, consciously modelled itself on Alexandria's example. Muslim scholars translated vast numbers of Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. They didn't just preserve this knowledge, but extended it, making major contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other sciences. The great physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, the philosopher Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes. These scholars were working in a tradition that traced back to Alexandria. When European scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries wanted to recover ancient Greek learning, they often had to translate it from Arabic back into Latin because the original Greek texts had been lost in the West. This transmission history reveals something important about the library's destruction. It wasn't a simple story of enlightenment versus barbarism, or reason versus superstition. Instead, it was a complex process where knowledge moved between cultures, was preserved in unexpected places, and was repeatedly lost and rediscovered. The library's physical destruction, whenever and however it occurred, was less important than the broader pattern of how knowledge is preserved or lost across civilizations. Every transition between civilizations risks losing knowledge as languages change, priorities shift, and the institutional structures that maintain libraries and schools are disrupted. Consider what happened to Archimedes' works. Archimedes, perhaps the greatest mathematician of antiquity, lived in the 3rd century BCE and would certainly have had his works copied to Alexandria. Most of his treatises survived through the medieval period in Greek manuscripts, but one of his most important works, the Method, was known only from references until 1906, when a scholar discovered it hidden beneath a Christian prayer book. The prayer book was a palimpsest, a manuscript where the original text had been scraped off and the parchment reused. Underneath the prayers, barely visible, was Archimedes' text, written 1,000 years earlier. The manuscript had been created in the 10th century, probably in Constantinople, but then, in the 13th century, a monk had decided that prayers were more important than ancient mathematics, and had scraped off Archimedes to reuse the expensive parchment. This palimpsest reveals the precariousness of textual survival. Every ancient work we have is the result of countless decisions by countless scribes, librarians, and patrons over thousands of years. Each time a text was copied, someone had to decide it was worth copying. Each time a library was maintained, someone had to provide resources. Each time a collection was threatened, someone had to decide what to save. The texts that survived were not necessarily the best or most important, but simply the ones that happened to be valued by the right people at the right times. What would we give to have the library back? The question is irresistible. If we could travel back in time with a camera or a scanner, if we could somehow recover the lost texts, what might we find? The complete works of Aristotle, not just the 40% that survived. The missing books of Livy's History of Rome, the lost plays of the great Athenian dramatists, scientific treatises that might advance our understanding of ancient technology, lost epics that rivaled Homer, historical accounts that would clarify events we only dimly understand. Some specific losses are particularly tantalizing. We know that Eratosthenes wrote a comprehensive 3-volume geography, combining mathematical precision with ethnographic observation. Only fragments survive. Claudius Ptolemy, writing centuries later, relied heavily on Eratosthenes' work, but Ptolemy's version has errors that Eratosthenes might not have made. Did those errors influence European geographical understanding and delay the age of exploration? We know that Hipparchus made observations of stellar positions that were astonishingly accurate. His star catalogue is lost. We rely on Ptolemy's later version, which has systematic errors. Did those errors set back astronomy? In medicine, Herophilus and Erasistratus performed systematic dissections of human bodies in Alexandria, something rarely done in the ancient world. They discovered the nervous system, distinguished between motor and sensory nerves, understood that the brain was the center of intelligence, and made detailed studies of the circulatory system. Their works are lost. We know about their discoveries only from references in later medical texts. How much more did they know? What surgical techniques did they develop? What treatments did they discover? Galen, writing centuries later, had access to some of their work, but also disagreed with some of their conclusions. Galen's work survived and became the basis of medieval medicine. But what if we had the works of Herophilus and Erasistratus themselves? The loss extends to literature that might have changed our understanding of ancient culture. We have 37 of Plato's dialogues, and scholars generally think we have most of what he wrote. But we have only fragments of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the thinkers who came before Socrates and Plato. We know their names: Heraclitus, Parmenides, Anaxagoras, Democritus, and we have quotations from their works preserved in other texts, but their actual books are gone. The library would have had complete copies. What might we learn about the origins of Western philosophy if we could read them in full, or consider literature by women? We know that the ancient world had women poets, philosophers, and writers, but their works have largely disappeared. Sappho was considered one of the greatest poets of antiquity, but of the 9 books of poetry she wrote, we have 1 complete poem and fragments of a few others. Most of what we know about her work comes from quotations in other authors, or from scraps of papyrus found in Egyptian rubbish heaps. The library would have had complete copies of Sappho's work. It would have had works by dozens or hundreds of other women writers, whose names we don't even know. What perspectives have we lost? What voices have been silenced by the library's destruction? There's a modern irony in our relationship to ancient texts. We have more access to the surviving ancient literature than anyone since antiquity. Digitization projects have made texts freely available online. Scholars can search entire corpora of ancient literature in seconds, something that would have taken months or years for ancient scholars. Yet we're acutely aware of the gaps. We know what we're missing in a way that medieval scholars didn't, because we have catalogues, references, and quotations that tell us what once existed. This knowledge of loss shapes classical scholarship, creating a discipline haunted by absence. Some scholars try to reconstruct lost works from fragments and references. This is painstaking work, assembling quotations from dozens of different sources, trying to reconstruct the argument of a lost book from citations in texts that survived. Sometimes we get lucky. The Roman poet Ovid wrote a tragedy called Medea that was famous in his time, but was lost by the Middle Ages. We have about 25 lines from it, quoted in various sources. Scholars have tried to reconstruct the full play, but it's like trying to reconstruct a symphony from hearing a few notes hummed by different people. You can get a sense of the melody, but the full composition is gone. The Alexandria Library project has inspired modern attempts at universal libraries. The Library of Congress, the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France all represent attempts to collect comprehensive knowledge. But the modern parallel is really the internet, and specifically projects like the Internet Archive, which is explicitly trying to preserve digital information for future generations. The comparison is illuminating. Like ancient Alexandria, the Internet Archive faces questions about scope, what to preserve and what to ignore, about resources, how to fund ongoing preservation, about access, who gets to use the collection and under what terms, and about durability, how to ensure that information remains accessible as technologies change. We face challenges Alexandria never imagined. The volume of information produced today dwarfs anything the ancient world could conceive. We create more information in a day than existed in all the world's libraries in antiquity. But digital information is also more fragile than papyrus scrolls in some ways. File formats become obsolete, storage media degrade, websites disappear, companies go out of business, taking their content with them. We might lose more of our digital cultural heritage than we realize, not through fire or conquest, but through neglect, format obsolescence, and the absence of institutional commitment to preservation. There's also the question of what future generations will want to know about us. The Library of Alexandria preserved what its curators thought was important: texts in Greek primarily, works by established authors, scholarly treatises. We don't know what they excluded: ancient Egyptian literature in demotic script, popular entertainment that seemed too lowbrow to preserve, technical manuals that seemed too practical, letters and personal documents that seemed too trivial. What we lost from Alexandria was filtered through the decisions of Hellenistic scholars about what constituted serious knowledge. What are we preserving today, and what are we ignoring that future generations might desperately want? One of the most poignant aspects of the library's loss is that it was gradual enough that people at the time didn't fully recognise what was happening. There was no single moment when everyone realised the library was gone. It faded. Scholars stopped coming. Funds dried up. Buildings fell into disrepair. Scrolls rotted. Collections were dispersed. And at each stage, it probably seemed like a temporary setback, not a permanent catastrophe. This is how most civilizational losses occur, not in dramatic fires, but in slow erosions, in funding cuts, in changing priorities, in the accumulation of small neglects, until suddenly something vital is gone and can't be recovered. There were people who recognized the loss. In the 6th century, 600 years after Caesar's campaign, scholars were already lamenting that the great library was gone and blaming various culprits. But by then, the institutional knowledge of how to maintain such a library, the trained librarians, the scribal schools, the scholarly community that used and valued it, all of that was also gone. You can't rebuild a great library without the intellectual ecosystem that sustains it. The building was the least important part. What made Alexandria great was the commitment to universal knowledge, the state's support for scholarship, the community of scholars, the networks that brought texts from around the world. Once those were gone, no amount of scrolls could recreate what was lost. Modern Alexandria has tried to reclaim this heritage. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002, is a conscious attempt to revive the ancient library spirit. It's a beautiful modern building near the site where the ancient library probably stood. It holds millions of books and has become a genuine centre of learning. But it can't recreate what was lost, any more than building a new Parthenon would restore the original. The new library is its own institution, serving the needs of a modern Egypt in a globalised world. And that's appropriate. The ancient library belonged to its time. Our loss is that we can't visit it, can't learn from it, can't recover what it knew. What can we learn from Alexandria's fate? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the fragility of knowledge. We tend to think of scientific and cultural progress as inevitable, as cumulative, always building on what came before. But the Library of Alexandria reminds us that progress can reverse. Knowledge can be lost. Civilizations can forget what they once knew. The destruction of the library contributed to what we sometimes call the Dark Ages, though that term is problematic and oversimplifies a complex period. But there's no question that the loss of Alexandria's knowledge, combined with the fall of Rome and the disruption of Mediterranean trade and cultural networks, resulted in a period where Western Europe knew less about mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy than had been known 1,000 years earlier. It took the better part of a millennium to recover some of what was lost, and some was never recovered at all. We talk about the Renaissance as a rebirth, but what was being reborn was largely knowledge that had existed in antiquity. When humanist scholars of the 15th century discovered manuscripts of Plato or Aristotle or Ptolemy, they were recovering knowledge that had been known in Alexandria 1,500 years earlier. Imagine what else might have been recovered if the library had survived. Imagine how much further we might be if we'd had continuity instead of catastrophic loss and slow recovery. Another lesson is about the importance of redundancy in preservation. The Library of Alexandria represented a concentration of knowledge that was both its strength and its weakness. Having everything in one place made it accessible to scholars who came there, but it also meant that when that place failed, everything was at risk. The survival of some ancient texts depended on them being copied and distributed to other libraries in other cities, Athens, Pergamum, Rome, Constantinople. The texts that survived often did so because they existed in multiple copies in multiple locations. Modern digital preservation follows this principle. The Internet Archive makes multiple copies of its holdings in different locations, specifically to avoid a single point of failure. There's also something to learn about cultural priorities. The Library of Alexandria thrived when there was a strong institutional commitment to knowledge for its own sake, when rulers saw supporting scholarship as a source of prestige and power. It declined when those priorities changed, when resources were diverted to other purposes, when scholarship seemed less important than religious correctness or military necessity. Every civilization makes choices about what it values and what it funds. These choices have long-term consequences that may not be apparent at the time. The Ptolemies who built the library probably didn't imagine that their investment would be remembered 3,000 years later, while their military victories are footnotes. The Roman emperors who defunded the library probably didn't think they were contributing to civilizational collapse, but they were. We can also think about the library in terms of what it meant for its time. For scholars in the ancient world, Alexandria represented a kind of paradise. It was a place where you could be paid simply to think, to read, to write, to debate ideas with the brightest minds of your generation. It was a place where knowledge was valued above practical utility, where you could pursue understanding for its own sake. This ideal has always been fragile. Every generation of scholars has to fight for it, has to justify why society should support research that doesn't have immediate practical applications, why we should preserve knowledge that most people will never use, why libraries and universities matter. The Library of Alexandria fell because it lost that fight. The society around it changed, and the library's value proposition stopped making sense to the people who controlled resources. In some ways, we're always fighting to prevent another Alexandria. Every time a library closes due to budget cuts, every time research funding is slashed, every time politicians question why taxpayers should support scholars studying obscure topics, we're relitigating the question of whether knowledge has value beyond its immediate utility. The Memory of Alexandria argues that it does, that preserving and extending human knowledge is one of the things that makes us civilized, and that losing that knowledge diminishes us in ways we may not recognize until it's too late. The story of the Library of Alexandria is ultimately a story about human ambition and human failure. The ambition to collect all knowledge, to make it accessible, to support scholarship as a civilization-level priority, that was magnificent. The failure to maintain that commitment, to protect that knowledge, to pass it intact to future generations, that was tragic. We're the inheritors of both the ambition and the failure. We have unprecedented tools for collecting and preserving knowledge, but we also face unprecedented challenges in doing so at scale. Will future generations look back at our time and marvel at what we preserved, or lament what we lost? The Library of Alexandria is gone. The building is rubble somewhere under the modern city, or beneath the Mediterranean waves. The scrolls are dust. The scholars are long dead. But the idea of Alexandria persists. It represents a dream of universal knowledge, of scholarship transcending borders, of investing in understanding for its own sake. That dream didn't die with the library. It's been reborn in different forms, in medieval monasteries and Islamic houses of wisdom, in Renaissance libraries and Enlightenment encyclopedias, in modern research universities and digital archives. Each generation tries to recreate Alexandria in some form, to build something that will outlast them, to preserve knowledge for the future. Whether we'll succeed where Alexandria failed remains to be seen. We have advantages they didn't, technologies for preserving and copying information that would seem like magic to ancient librarians. But we also have disadvantages, the sheer volume of information to preserve, the rapid obsolescence of formats and technologies, the fragmentation of knowledge into specialties so narrow that scholars in one field can't understand scholars in adjacent fields. We have our own barbarians at the gates, whether that's budget cuts to libraries and universities, or digital rights management that prevents preservation, or platforms that can delete vast archives of human creativity with a corporate decision, or AI systems trained on scraped data without regard for preservation or attribution. The lesson of Alexandria is that preservation requires active effort. Knowledge doesn't preserve itself. Libraries don't maintain themselves. The default state is loss. Everything we have from the ancient world exists because someone, at some point, decided it was worth the effort to copy it, to maintain it, to pass it on. Most things weren't worth that effort, or weren't deemed to be, and so they're gone. The Library of Alexandria is a reminder that civilizations can lose their memory, that knowledge is always one generation away from extinction, and that what we choose to preserve and how we choose to preserve it will determine what future generations can know about us and about the world. So when you think about the Library of Alexandria, don't imagine a single dramatic fire destroying everything in one catastrophic moment. Instead, imagine a slow sunset, with the light gradually fading until one day someone realizes it's dark, and no one remembers quite when the last light went out. Imagine scholars arriving to find the doors closed, or finding the doors open, but the scrolls gone, or finding scrolls but no one left who cares to read them. Imagine the last librarian, whose name we'll never know, who maintained the collection as long as they could before finally giving up because there were no more resources, no more support, no more point. That's how the greatest library in the ancient world ended. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not through malice, but through neglect. Not in a day, but across centuries. And that's what makes the loss even more heartbreaking, because it suggests that it could have been prevented if people had realised what they were losing before it was too late.